Welcome all to this webinar on software commercialization. My name is Sahand Zanjani. I'll be your host today. I'm a consultant at Oxentia. In Oxentia, we deliver innovation strategy advice, training, and accelerator programs to organizations around the world. In today's webinar, we're going to discuss commercializing software from academia. With rise of non-tangible assets such as data, software commercialization is even more important. Most UK spinouts are either a software company or has an offering which is based on software and revolves around software, and those software are basically developed by those companies. Before becoming a consultant, personally, I worked as a researcher in biomechanics. Whilst in research, I use a lot of technical software, so many of them open source, and so many of them based on the university research project. But why so little of them are commercialized? Is this because they serve a different purpose? Is there no will to commercialize them? Is there too little to gain, or are there too many hurdles? In today's webinar, we will discuss how academics can commercialize their developed software, and our panelists will share their successful experience and knowledge from their unique perspectives. We will be recording this webinar and we'll share the recording with you all later this week. We have a few questions lined up for our panelists that we'll start with, but please feel free to ask questions in the chat, and we'll ask those questions. I'll promise that I will ask those questions in the end, the last 15 minutes, hopefully. So our panelists today are Elizabeth Bain, Head of IP and Licensing, Science and Technology in Science and Technology Facilities Council, UKRI. Elizabeth, would you mind introducing yourself more?
Yeah, hello everybody. I'm Elizabeth Bain. I manage the intellectual property for STFC, a bit more snappy than the Science and Technology Facilities Council. We at the SDFC, we design, build and maintain and operate large-scale scientific infrastructure and instrumentation to enable researchers to carry out fundamental research. And those are in the fields of space science. We have a central laser facility. We have all the large scale, all the telescopes that you'd probably see on the television on the BBC. We've had a part in that, the James Webb, for example, as well. And we have, in all of our facilities, we have 2 synchrotrons. In all of our facilities are underpinned by software. And that's software to run them, software to analyze the data, software to design them. So we've got a huge amount of software in STFC, and it's a big part of my day job to manage that, and also to look for commercialization opportunities. Thank you, Zander.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. We have Mark Mann, Managing Director of Mark Mann OU.
Yeah, hello everybody. Mark Mann OU started about a year ago. Before that, I was working as a technology transfer manager, to use the old parlance, at the University of Oxford, at Oxford University Innovation. My background is as an engineering researcher, firstly at the University of Cambridge, where I did a bit of software, but it was mostly electronic devices and materials, before I moved on to the BBC, where I worked in the research and development department there, where I worked exclusively on software of various different guises in my 4 years there. Whilst at the BBC, I transferred over to technology transfer, and at Oxford, as well as doing technology transfer, I developed a humanities, social sciences, and eventually social enterprise portfolio as well. Now I'm a consultant in strategic innovation.
Thank you very much, Mark. And we have Jeroen Bergmann, Associate Professor in Engineering Science in University of Oxford, and also Director of Oxford Health Tech Labs. Jeroen.
Thank you very much, and yes, welcome everyone as well. Great to be here. So my name is Jeroen. I've been focusing on engineering, so specifically kind of biomedical engineering, for a very long time now. and I'm part of the Faculty of Engineering Science. So a lot of digital development is happening within our department, and a lot of that is also being spun out of the university directly. In our lab, we kind of have an interest in the digital space. We have just kind of spun out another company called Regmetrics that is particularly focusing on how to navigate regulations in a digital space. And more, I guess, for this panel, more interesting as well is I have also a position as the director of the Oxford Health Tech Labs, where we kind of build up teams from the ground up. And we have a particular focus on, again, digital health. So that has been running for over 6 years now. And there's been quite a few companies that came out of that particular lab that has been quite successful. So looking forward to have some further discussions with the other panelists on that.
Me too, Jeroen. Thank you very much. So before we start, we would like to know our audience. So I'm going to launch a poll. So if you take a few seconds to answer the poll that is coming up right now, and so we know our audience. So which category best describe your place of work? Are you in academia? Are you do you work in corporate, within a government organization, or a tech transfer professional? And also, which sector experience do you have? Energy, finance, healthcare, STEM, shape, or any other? We'll wait for a few seconds. A few more seconds, so it's 1 minute. 7 more people left. Right, perfect. So just so you know, we have a lot of academics and tech transfer professionals. We have 4 people from corporate and 4 people from governmental organization, 3 others, and mostly from STEM background, but we do have healthcare professionals as well, and other backgrounds as well. Perfect. Nice. So let's begin. Can I ask Mark, please? Mark, so how software commercialization is different than classic tech transfer? How is it different, first of all? And in your experience, what hurdles were there, and what was different about the process?
Okay, so classical technology transfer. Well, I've just been back from about a month ago. It was the big North American technology transfer conference, and that was a conference which was largely discussing patents and why, and they were at the stage where they were asking why they might have to do something else. They were doing software as well, but traditional technology transfer, right from the very beginning, has been about trying to sell patents, trying to find a patent, trying to find something novel, some intellectual property, which you can then file a patent and then sell in some form through either a license or by licensing into a spin out or something like that. Now, you can do that with software as well, but software is, when we talk about software, it's a vastly complex space, or it doesn't have to be very complex at all. So you have huge degrees of complexity in the types of software that you can get. You can have just a little bit of code, which is written in Python, which is a very simple language, up to vast, pages and pages and pages of code, which do very complex things, and they can be applied in all sectors of society. And so, as a former, shall I say former technology transfer professional, maybe I can say that. Well, the first question you'd always ask is when you get a new disclosure is, oh, what are you flogging? What have we got here? What have I got? And so you're trying to work out whether it's going to be some source code, which is the actual code as written by the researcher, or is it can it be wrapped up in object code, which is essentially just hiding it in a box, so people can't edit it and change it. And then you've also got to look at whether the researcher has already put licensing terms on the software that's written already, and then who might be interested in it, and under what terms would they be willing to take that software, and finally, probably the most important thing is, well, what does the researcher actually want to do with the code in the first place? You know, what impact do they want to make with it? And it was used to be my job to try and navigate that multidimensional space and try and find the best deal for everybody. And it's not always easy.
I bet not. Thanks, Mark. Can I ask you're on the same question as in you're a champion of commercialization in Oxford. How software commercialization is different than classic tech transfer that you were involved in, and what was as an academic, basically, what were the hurdles that you faced and the process of the commercialization to you as an academic, from an academic perspective?
Yeah, of course. A great and interesting question as well, because I think to some extent there's also a lot of similarities. One of the key things is when you are thinking about the software is we normally as an academic think about what is the research question that we are trying to answer with the software. So hence we are kind of exploring that from a scientific academic kind of perspective. It also means that the kind of the need, the problem we are solving doesn't always reflect the commercial potential of it. And that kind of shift of going from an academic need to a commercial need can be quite difficult. I think the idea for software, where in hardware, there needs to be a lot of steps to be taken to kind of move the hardware into manufacturing, into production. The idea is always that for software, this is kind of quicker, but nonetheless, you know, touching base on some of the key elements that come into play when you move from a kind of more academic software to commercial software is these kind of aspects of code review. So how do we review our code? Who's reviewing it? How do I ensure that my code is robust? Thinking about ways of dealing with, for example, the data protection. We kind of think about it from a science point of view and kind of deal with that and often hard code some of these things in our solutions. But once it becomes commercialized, it has to be more dynamic. What happens if I add a new module to it? How do I update my code? And how do I do that with a team that is growing? And these kind of things are often not considered. So I think there are some differences, but I think also there's a lot of similarities in terms of the hurdles that we see in general of commercializing these kind of academic endeavors.
Can I ask a question there? Can I ask a follow-up, which is, so we talked about code review and an awful lot of process and arduous process there. Do you enjoy any of it?
So I think I'm a bit strange. So I appreciate that. I think as with everything, you want to kind of make sure that when you put something out, it is really working the way it should be working. It should be really robust. It should be really well tested. And sometimes there's a lot of constraints in terms of the times and in terms of the things that that you have available. And it is, as you kind of are trying to translate the work, it's quite enjoyable to see that the work that you produced has kind of doesn't contain any errors, doesn't contain any bugs, or you kind of solved some of the big problems that you were facing. So I think if you take the view that you are improving and you are pushing something out that you can be more comfortable on, it's quite enjoyable. If you just kind of look at the amount of time it takes, it's kind of less enjoyable.
Okay, thanks both. Thank you, Jeroen, and thank you, Mark, for the question. I want to ask, go on, Lizzie, what are you gonna?
Oh, I was just thinking that you sort of talked about the whole journey for us. It's at STFC, when I first arrived, we were actually licensing out quite a lot of our codes, our simulations, to very knowledgeable postdocs that worked in companies in research departments. I mean, nobody could actually pick up one of our pieces of code and use it unless they had a doctorate and a very keen interest in the code. And we were actually licensing quite a lot of code back then. We had a bit of a dip and we've moved on now. And one of the things that really does sort of stall us is there's obviously, and this will be in everybody will have this experience, you know, the sort of spaghetti ownership of any software in our sort of research, collaborative research organizations, how you have multiple owners and finding out whether you are proprietary, how much of the software you own, if you own enough of it, how much, again, you talked about the terms and conditions of the licenses that can influence what you can do with it in the future. So that was the next part after we had all of these softwares, was looking at when people bring me things, can I license this? You look at it, well, don't own very much of it. And then we sort of gone through the journey where we're now actually moving through, and we've got 2 spin-out companies, and we've got a couple of projects now where we're trying to build the user interfaces up and get them to a more robust stage. I'm not sure we'll ever be at the stage of robustness as that yours are, Jeroen, that we can certainly move things up the TRL and push them out the door that way, maybe for more interested parties, and maybe try to tap into a wider market.
So I'm wondering, have we identified one of the key things there? Because you said, there was this like the spaghetti of trying to work out the ownership of who's done something here, and that's when I was working as an engineer, for instance, an engineering researcher. I was in the lab and I was doing my experiments in a machine, and it was perfectly clear that I was the creator and the IP was mine, and there wasn't really anybody else involved. But obviously, software is a very collaborative thing to do. You have GitHub or Subversion or whatever it is that you're using, where lots of people are contributing to a repository, and we have all these processes in technology transfer which are designed for lonely PhD student in a lab somewhere, rather than this collaborative effort. And do you think that's one of the big hurdles, is where people just go, oh, do you know what, I can't be bothered?
I think it's both. It's an opportunity as well, because you have the buy-in for all those organizations that have invested in that code, so you've kind of got their energy as well. And some of our really big projects, we have sort of 3, I don't know if we're going to get onto that in a minute. We've got 3 ways of commercializing at STFC. One is sort of the collaborative cooperative model, where all monies that are made go back into the project and go to create more code. And that's a massive mixture of open source, different licenses, different owners. And we have a user interface that brings that together so we can license to industry. So we've got a couple of projects like that, big projects, and we want to build more of those. But that takes the energy of the community and a good leader to make that work. And we're starting to put more of our proof of concept monies into those to try to get those off the ground, to try to make them a bit more tighter in the way they operate, so we can draw down bigger money for them, so they can put more money into them. So they're sort of big impact, big international and European projects almost in themselves. They run conferences, and you've probably all been to their conferences, the CCPs. So those where we're kind of like the manager of that, the independent face of the collaboration being the research council. We then got the license to industry, which we don't do a lot of, I must admit. And people come to us and it's almost we scrabble around trying to find them a license. They want it, they want this code, oh my goodness. We're getting better at that now as well. So we're getting a system in place, we're automating as much as we can to take the pain out of negotiating tiny license deals that cost more to negotiate than we make in revenues. And we also have, like I say, 2 spin-out companies, which is one of them successful, one of them we've brought back in-house to mature a little bit more. The market's not ready for it yet. So we're lucky enough to be able to do that sort of thing here at SDFC.
Just a quick question on that. You mentioned kind of technology readiness net level. What kind of level are you seeing when these ideas are kind of going out?
When they're going out, literally, I would say at the moment, it depends where they're going to. Even so, I would say that in the big collaborative space, I'd say that there are big libraries, our mathematical libraries, our material libraries, those kind of things that we bring together with a user interface. But the user interface, I'd say you've probably still got to have a very keen interest in computing to be able to use it. The farmer companies have research departments where they have doctorates and scientists with enough computing knowledge to be able to use these things. They're not like Windows we can click, and we'd love to be at that stage, but that's a long way off. However, we're now looking at other, in our spin out, we're hoping to get to the level where we can actually license software one day, but at the moment we're offering a service. And that's for our ground station technology, where we establish rainfall and which ground stations we should keep operational, and switching to different ground stations from satellites. And this is for when we're working in the KA and Q and V band. So that's moving up to the new bands of wavelengths. So those are the sort of that's one of us. That's another is formeric, and that's automatic formulation of it's simulating the first bit of R&D that you would need for I said making home care goods, for example. If you're going to make a new soap, a new shampoo, the marketeer comes in and says, we want honey in our shampoo, and you're thinking, yuck, honey, sticky, how are we going to do that? But that's taking out that first painful research bit where you're doing a lot of the analysis. So that can be automated. Unfortunately, the market's not ready for that yet. So we've brought it back in-house. But yeah, they're pretty raw. Our codes are pretty raw code. They're alpha state, all of them. So yes, and we're a research organisation. I think that universities take more care before they publish their codes on GitHub. When they make them open source, we will just put them out there for people to use. We won't spend as much time cleaning them up. That's the impression I get. I can't speak for everybody, of course, STFC, because we have 2,000 engineers and scientists who are, all work to quite high standards. So.
Yeah, no, and I think it's very similar, but I'm looking at Mark, who can probably provide a bit of a better overview. But I think what you mentioned, the user interface, is a very important aspect, because a lot of academics and we too, we kind of go, oh, the code works, it does its job, we're done. But in reality, a lot of the traction you will get to commercialize it is the user interface. So it's great if it's open source and people need it and they kind of know how to implement it. They want to spend time on it and it's their field. But if you want to do something at scale, it's often that it requires a good user interface, and it's one of those things that often is not included in the initial kind of academic work. But Mark can probably.
Well, it's not a research question, is it? That's the thing, is you do the UI unless you're actually a researcher in user experience. It's which there are. It's not going to be part of it, and so putting that wrapper around the research code is actually key to making that successful transfer. Occasionally, you do see that user interface being developed within a department. They decide they're going to put some, in a particular university, they're going to put some effort into making some money for the department, and so they'll hire a team of specialists, maybe a couple of coders, to build a GUI and to maintain the data, the software as it's going forward, and continually licensing out. And I mean, you see that as one of the key things in some of the departments in Oxford do that thing quite well. But generally, the model is if you need user interface, it's either license it to a company who will build that, or you start your own to do it and then license it from that. And that's generally what the model is.
Yeah, I think we've fallen into the pitfall a few times of thinking that we can give a department money to build a user interface. That has not worked. It's all become money for a postdoc,
Yeah.
It's not the ideal. The postdoc too wants to do new and original and exciting stuff. They don't want to write user interface.
But it's
no, go on.
It's an interesting concept, because I do think this idea of building a user interface, it is really essential. Also, when groups go and talk to investors, they go, yeah, great, anyway, show me what it does. And they go, well, let me kind of pull up my my code and I'll kind of run you through it. And they go, I don't really get what you're doing. And unfortunately, we do see companies fail because they don't really know exactly. I think that in the commercial space, there's a few things why they fail. One often is because they don't know exactly the need that they are catering for. for the software, but the other thing is also that they can't convey the message well enough, and the user interface is an important aspect. So I can imagine something, if you have money, to not say this is for a postdoc, to say, okay, well, we're going to spend this money for you to work with a user interface expert or a company to develop it, and that's how you have to then spend it. And we do that actively. We have in-house, we have quite a few people with a design background, but we also know our limitations, and we work actively with other companies that are experts on it, and you can really see that it makes a massive difference in terms of how people can engage with the work that you are producing.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, that's great. I am going to ask you to talk about the software commercialization business model. So how Europe pretty much. Did you commercialize an open source software? How is it not free? What's the difference between free software and open source software? And how did you commercialize an open source software? And having an open source, does it prevent software commercialization or does it help it?
So I think I'm quite unique. So I'm going to push some of those nuances to Elizabeth and Mark, but I'll kind of tell a bit about what I've done. So because we are in the healthcare space, and the software has to go through regulations, which is quite an intense process. So it can become very difficult to go through all those regulations in an open source manner. So you normally want to try to kind of ensure that the way that you develop your software and meeting the requirements of the regulations allows you to build up a very strong code. So there's a lot of nuances. It also means that there's some complexity by making it open source, or more specifically, there's some complexity by having other people changing the code, because one key part of the regulations is to say, you know, this code is now working, it is meeting these requirements, it is adhering to certain conformity assessments, and then how do you track that if other people are starting to change that code? And that's a big problem in general. You know, how do you ensure with kind of databases, machine learning, artificial intelligence, that the system is not changing in such a way that it does things that you don't want it to do? So how do you keep track of that? But that's one of the reasons why you see a lot of the healthcare focus, and similar to other areas of software where there's a lot of regulations, there's to some extent a preference, if you want to commercialize it, or if you want to kind of build on it, that you kind of keep it quite close so that you have control over the quality of the software.
Perfect. Elizabeth, please.
Oh yeah, well, I'll pick up your free software, open software question, I think. What is free software? Well, there's no such thing as free software. When some people think of as free software, I think, oh, my heart sinks a little bit. So we go and talk. We say, well, what do you want to do with your software? We try to encourage people to come to us as sort of open source champions, if you like, in the IP team, to talk about the license that they might put their open source code out on. They may release their code on. So, you know, open source means that you must obey the four freedoms. You must allow whoever's using it to be able to run it, copy it, modify it, and distribute it. And there will be a license that articulates the obligations associated with those four freedoms. So, you know, you'll have everything in your open source software, from permissive to copyleft. Copyleft is your GNU public licenses that are a little bit ambiguous, quite litigious, and industry tends to shy away from them. It's not that you can't commercialize those softwares, and they can be a commercial tool, and some industries use them as a commercial tool, that license. Or permissive. Permissive is our preferred license, which is very like, you know, you can't, please don't sue us. You know, you're not going to sue us. It's just a sign off to say that you can use this, but it's at your own risk, really. And please acknowledge us. So we go with the BST license. Obviously, we talk to whoever's come to us and says they want to make it open source about what they want to do with it. You know, if they want to build a community, I'll say, well, that's great. It's a lot of energy. It doesn't just happen. You can't just build a community. And some people have got a software that they're getting pressure from the community to put that out as open source. So they want to put it out as open source, but they also, you know, and this is where you get pushed to the copyleft licenses, because you want to see how many people are using it. And you can't really tell with the permissive licenses who's picking up and using or modifying your software. So we have got a couple of very big GPL control softwares, Manted, and I think there's another one in ISIS. And these are international softwares that we now have boards to run, because they've grown so big, and you get special rules from going to a public license for that. So yes, you can commercialize open source code, but the obligations in your license will tell you what your limits are. So if you've got a piece of code, we once had 5 codes, and it was for looking at different traces in the atmosphere from Earth observation. And we thought, well, this is great, you know, we can commercialize this, but one of them was GPL. We said, well, we can still offer this as a service, you know, we can still, it's going to be published anyway, so we can publish it with its modifications, put it into the spin-out company, and then you can offer it as a service. If you don't distribute it, you don't have to publish your modifications. And this, if you turn it on its head for a company, and I don't know if this is true or if it's just a rumor, that EDF made one of their very big softwares open source, and that was to so that all their suppliers would have to use that and publish all the modifications, and they'd always have access to modifications in the supply chain. So there are different benefits. Red Hat say that they only use open source, but they also have a lot of patents. I used to have the same patent attorney, so it's not that not quite as open source and free and easy as you might like to think. So yeah, you can. There's different business models. For example, you can put user interface on, sell the license your user interface, and direct people to the code that they want to use. You're not actually the person that's modifying or changing anything. There's different things you can do. You have to analyze it and look at it very carefully when you are doing that, depending on what the license is. Like I say, we prefer BSD licenses so we can't get into trouble. Mm-hmm. And when we have got a GPL license, or actually any open source, quite often someone will say it's less hassle, it's costing us more to license this, to create the license, to collect the money, than it is to just make it open source. We'll say, fine, yeah, that makes sense. But then the company still comes back to us because they've got a no open source policy in their company. So we still have to issue the licenses and charge them. So yeah, it doesn't stop you commercializing it. It just makes you think more carefully about your business plan and what your business plan might be. Mark.
You do, and it depends on, yeah. So that wrapper of putting some like your UI around it. I often see models where that UI is actually it's not open source. It's you know, and it depends on what sort of open source license you have, whether you're actually allowed to do that or not. But you know, so you make that the user interface proprietary, and then you have the open source as basically the engine of the car. But I mean, I have to be honest, when I have the conversations about whether we're going to commercialize software or not, at least half of them will go along the lines of, well, if we're going to sell this, we're just going to have to start again, because it's got so many bugs in it. I mean, you know, we're just going to take the algorithms and rewrite them in properly, or in a different language or something, or with a different structure or something like that. And so when you're in that situation, you can then sort of plan forward as to what you think the licensing terms should actually be. One of the things that I used to use in Oxford was an academic license, which was free for people to use for teaching and research, and no obligations, just to you know, say thanks. And then, but if you wanted to use it for commercial purposes, then you had to have a conversation basically with me to work out, well, you know, what sort of deal would be done. There are certain industries, you know, like for instance, I used to work in the broadcast industry. Don't know if it's shifted on in the last few years. I was on a board in a spin out which was focused on the broadcast industry. Generally tend to want to have proprietary software, or at least a service agreement with a supplying company that they can sue if something goes wrong. For instance, if BBC One goes off the air, or the subtitles stop working, or something like that. And so, you know, in that instance, you have a problem if it's open source. People in the broadcasting industry just wouldn't generally touch it. So it depends on the sector. It depends on what you're trying to do, and where you're trying to do it. But there are ways of doing it. So the answer is, it depends. The last thing I would say is that when an academic makes his or her software open source, it doesn't mean that you're giving it away for nothing, because as Elizabeth said earlier, it's only generally intelligible to people who work in the field tightly. So, you know, you're not giving it away to everybody. You might be giving it away just to a few people. And yes, and I saw that one of the questions in the chat was, should universities stop worrying about protecting software in the way that they do? And my answer is a very robust yes. And the one caveat I will say to that is, if you're doing a spin-out company, it is easier to raise early stage funding if your software is patented. It's just a fact they just look for that. There's some of the early stage investors.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. I wanted to ask about the will now. So, based on your experience, is there a will to commercialize software in academia? Is there an actual will to do that? Elizabeth.
Go on, Elizabeth, you go.
Yeah. I mean, is there a will? It's a very diverse community. I mean, at STFC, we have lots of different types of people writing code. We've got the software scientists and software engineers. We've got the scientists themselves. And the engineers all writing code. So the writing code for instruments, writing code to analyze data, all sorts of things, writing simulation code to carry out the experiments alongside the actual experiments. So we've got all sorts of different personalities, I suppose, and you do in life generally. But I think it is an area where people are the most of, I find in the scientific computing area, people are very keen to, they don't mind commercializing, but they want the money back into the community. And they want that to build the code. Like we said before, they want to keep the research code going, build the libraries, and make it work that way. We have incentivization schemes at STFC that are similar to the university ones. And they enable people to have shares in companies if they, an equity sharing company, if they spin out, royalty flow back, if we license software. But most of the licenses, the royalty bearing licenses that are part of the scheme are those which are software that come from underpinning our facilities, so the more engineering side of things, than the actual pure software computing area, where those are very much community-based projects. So it's almost a line, if you like, where, and it is in the right place, where this is my day job, I shouldn't get anything extra. It's not tech transfer, this is my job. Whereas if you have a piece of code and it's going out to industry, well, you weren't employed, you were employed in STFC to do research. You weren't employed to take something to a commercial end. So in that instance, you would have an equity share or royalty flow back. And the same with some of the codes with the user interface as well. Though those are that's not a huge part of our commercialization, software to industry. It does sit more with the big collaborative projects and more now towards spin-outs. And you're right about the patents. This is where you get the ownership issues as well. You'll have someone who's really good at code, writing the code, someone sitting over their shoulder saying, put this in it, this one, the scientist. So who owns the copyright? The person writing it that hasn't So when the patent comes, who owns the patent? The person that didn't write it. So you can end up in some funny situations, as long as they're all still friends and we own the IP anyway and can put it into the spin-out company, that's fine.
Pretty sure Mark has a lot to say about that.
Yeah.
Experience. Mark, do you want to share your experience about that?
Oh, I've seen all sorts of things, and there's been everything through an altruistic feeling of, well, I'm the researcher and I've been paid by government money and I don't feel like I should make any money out of it, and I don't think anybody else should either. They should be given away freely to the world, etc. Which is wonderful and altruistic, but it's not actually a particularly successful way of doing things in general, because it normally just gets left on the shelf because there needs to be some marketing done so that people know that it exists, and this costs money, and so but there is this element of, well, I did write this software for everybody to use, and that potentially we don't have all of the business models properly utilized for tech transfer. For instance, there's not enough coming out in, which I say, non-profits or social enterprises, where you can actually have profitable things subsidizing things which are altruistic, or whether you get funded by a philanthropist to do something. It's not something that's always been readily been used. Then you get through to the other end of the spectrum, which is where you have an academic who, for instance, really does want to commercialize it because they know that they've come up with something which could make them an awful lot of money, and good for them, fantastic. I mean, and dare I say, there is academics I've worked with who are now have made a lot of money, and that's great. And you get the arguments which are university equity policies and things like that. So does a university contribute to a piece of software being written in the same way that it contributes to, say, a vaccine being developed? And there's a very interesting argument to be had there as to how much equity a university should have in these sorts of spin-outs. And that can be a bit of a hindrance to getting things out, because they feel that the university is taking money which they should be having for themselves. But that's unusual, actually. Generally, you do get people, academics, who say, I'm a researcher, I want to focus on my research and teaching. I don't really want to engage with investors and things like that. I just want to focus on my research because that's my love. And that's but then you also have who, well, realize that they want to make an impact on the world, and this is the way that they want to do that, they're going to need to do it. And even though they don't really like a lot of the process, because there is an awful lot of process involved in it, it can be, especially with software, when you're working out who's an inventor, who's a coder, what value do you give to each bit of the code, which algorithm, and dare I say, you often get an awful lot of horse trading which comes along, which can be quite unpleasant at times. And then there's the ordeal of going through raising investment, and then there's actually doing the work in the company when you've actually spun it out, which takes you away from your core research and your teaching. But people want to do that because they feel like it's their responsibility to get things out into the world. So you get everything. You get all sorts of different types of people and academics, and so I suppose in conclusion to all that, you need to have a diversity of solutions for institutions and for individuals, so that you optimize the amount of stuff that gets out of the door. And rather than trying to force everybody into one model, into one box, because if you do that, then you're going to put an awful lot of people off. And if your motivation is to get as much knowledge transferred out as possible, then it's diversity that you need, diversity of models.
Thank you. Jeroen, do you, well, you had the will, obviously, but what about your colleagues? Do you want to share your experience on that as well, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So Yeah, reiterating some of the things that were said, I think the key thing is not all software needs to be commercialized. As mentioned, it's absolutely fine for academics not to commercialize it. It's absolutely fine to kind of use different routes to create impact. And I think that that's important, is to kind of be aware that there are multiple ways, as has been kind of mentioned, to reach impact. Having said that, I do think there are certain areas where you have to really consider that commercialization pathway in order to create impact. And a good example, again, is in a lot of industries where a lot of additional work is required. So it's not enough to say, oh, well, I've done the coding. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, just the basic algorithm, that's the easy part. The hard part is to really getting from there to a useful end product. And I think that requires time, effort. And one way of kind of allowing you to have the time and the effort is by commercializing it, or to kind of bring in industry partners to help you with that impact. And again, we talked about the vaccine. I know it's not kind of software, but it's a good kind of comparison to software in terms of there's a lot of things required in order to create such an impact, and you can't do that at university level. There needs to be industry involved. So if you are truly translating research, you have to be aware that that's the way to do it. There are few people who have so bright ideas that they are being picked up, but the majority got snowed under, because if they are not themselves taking the effort to kind of showcase the value of it, it might not be picked up well enough. So I think that's an important thing to be aware of, and hence there is more interest now. And then I think finally, from a funding perspective, there's a push from the funders to say, you know, what has happened to my funding? I've kind of given you a lot of money and it's a paper, great, but you know, what has happened after your paper? And you go, oh, nothing. I kind of I've done the work, and someone else can figure out how to kind of apply it. But if there's no one else to figure that out, then it kind of stops. So the funders are keen on seeing progress being made on the research that they are funding. And again, the commercialization is a route to potentially create that impact, and that is also good for the funders to kind of see real world impact through those kind of approaches.
Thank you so much. We barely scratched the surface, to be honest. I want to ask so many more questions, but we didn't have, maybe we can have the same panel in a bit of time later in the year, so we can ask more questions from them. But as promised, we're gonna ask some questions from the audience's questions. I think the first one, Mark raised one, Elizabeth kind of answered, well, at least mentioned. So we're going to come back to that. Rushab Shah, Elizabeth, when you say brought spin-out back in-house, was it making it wholly owned subsidiary or dissolving the entity?
We dissolved the business and we've brought it back in-house to sort of, and we've got a little proof of concept pot of money. We're putting a bit of money into just keeping it going, ticking it over, and trying to get it to a higher TRL. I think we had some investment, so we spun it out probably earlier than we should have. We had an opportunity to spin it out, and maybe we should have waited a bit longer. However, yeah, so we actually dissolved the company.
Thank you.
We've brought the IP, we've brought the intellectual property. Well, the intellectual property is licensed, but it's no longer licensed.
Next question, Georgia says, I'm an academic who is totally clueless how to commercialize my software. You are having a nice conversation, but it is unclear to me how to concretely, can academics commercialize their software? Mark, can you address that?
I would then go to ask, well, whoever my equivalent is in your institution, because it depends. As what we were trying to illustrate, it's a very complex space, because you've got to decide what the model is, because it depends on the sector, who your potential clients are or partners are. It depends on what state your software is in, what format it needs to be in at the end. It's, as I said at the beginning, it's a multidimensional optimization problem. And it's not something that you're going to be able to do by yourself. You'll need to have somebody who is an expert who's done a few of these before, ideally, to work out what the best route to market is, and it will depend, and it will probably involve. I say it depends, but there's always some very standard bits of process, which are you have your research code or your software, but it probably isn't in a state which either is something that you would show to people who isn't an expert in the field. So you need to get a piece of funding from somewhere, translational funding, which if it comes from a research council, to build a demonstration of it. I'm not saying a fully operational system, but something which can effectively demonstrate the concept and the use that it can add. And then there's the next, which is the choice of going down the licensing route or the let's start a company route, or let's just keep it in-house and build a whole team to deploy it, which occasionally happens. There are all sorts of different options. Can't tell you which is the best one.
We had a bit of a discussion, very nice discussion. Well, Sam Conway said, unfortunately, the UI is often where investors see value. And Randy said, unfortunately, well, yes, of course. So will the customer who actually buy the software and generate the ROI that's desired? Great, thank you very much for that. I'll look for questions now. The next, thank you for your contribution. Keith O'Brien asked, if the academics want to build and commercialize a mobile app, what specific considerations should the academic or technology transfer office be mindful of? That's a great question.
So
yeah,
I'm
Jeroen,
happy to kind of jump in there. I think also just to link back to what Mark mentioned, because I think that's absolutely true, to kind of talk to kind of the experts in your institution, but also you're the one that understands the software. So if you can kind of give them guidance on what you think you're solving is important. And if you don't really know, it seems so easy. Oh, I know what the problem is, but often is not that easy. It could be an assumption that you have. So maybe talk to the people you think you're going to help and say, hey, are you interested in this? And kind of get some information so that when you talk to the commercialization experts, you can kind of tell them, yeah, I've kind of, people are asking about this, or people are having an interest, or no, I thought there was an interest, but it's at least not in this area. What do you maybe recommend to explore? So similar to the app, with the mobile app. So again, why mobile? I think that's where it should start. So we are thinking about solving a problem with the software, and the fact that it's a mobile app should provide some utility. So it should indicate that a mobile app is a better way of solving that problem than potentially something that runs on a desktop or laptop. So you can think about these kind of aspects of how does it kind of fit back into the problem and what would be the most suitable approach. If you do a mobile app, so some of the things we did with some of our mobile app development is to consider, do people use it? So we built a front page where we asked people to click on it to start using it. We didn't build anything behind that, but it was just a user study to figure out, do people even take the effort to click on the app? Because if you don't even open the app, it doesn't matter what's behind it. So depending on what is on offer and how you think people would kind of use it, you can test out smaller things. So I would definitely, when you are building up software, when you are exploring what your software does in terms of the need, try to build prototypes that allow you to test out the ideas that you have, to kind of allow you to ask better questions on what you're trying to solve. And I think those are kind of good steps to get building an application that then has traction.
The only thing I'd add to that is, so that's absolutely the next step. But I would say that if it's a tech transfer office at university, and if the answer is that it is best as a mobile app, that sounds like a startup or a spin out to me, because you need to have a regular refresh, software refresh every 3 years. You've got to keep up with all the different mobile devices and platforms. It's not something that you can do from a department. You really can't. And it's you could license it to a company, but generally I find that the model doesn't really work very well if through a license. So it just sounds like if it's mobile, it's likely to be a startup.
Well, thanks. Sam Conway now again. What key advice would you give to a founding academic or team on negotiating royalty rates on a software licensing deal? I think Lizzie.
Yeah, this is a tricky one. I mean, I would, well, at STFC, we would say, well, why don't you let us do it for you? We at STFC, we own the IP, so that's an automatic. And the university may own the IP, I don't know, depending on what level of academia you're at and who your employer is. So yes, well, we do quite a lot of research before we would go into negotiations. And the research we would do is we'd look at similar softwares. I mean, it may be completely unique. So we look at something like a sister product, if you like, look at what they're charging. We try and get as much market information as we can before we go into negotiations. And we would set ourselves rates depending on, for example, we have a software at the moment. It's still fairly alpha state. It's not quite fully formed yet, but I know the competitor in the market is charging about £88,000 per project, not per seat, not per. It's a lot of money, or dollars. Sorry, dollars. So I know that's the competitive price. We're not at that stage yet, but even so, it means that we can take a big. We want to take market share, and we can move in with a fairly high starting price. On the other hand, some of our other stuff, we've just set very standard rates of £2,500 per seat, 10,000, depending on what the software is really and what it does. If we're licensing something into an industry where it's going to take someone pretty clever to run it, and they've specifically come to us to use it rather than us going out and selling it, then we probably wouldn't charge that much for it. And for those type of softwares, we're setting standard rates really within house so that we don't have to keep having to have negotiations over the price and to reset the price every time. So I think that the most important thing is, if you're going to go in and negotiate rates, do your homework first, set your upper and your lower limits, maybe do a negotiation course as well. Make sure there's a few of you in there. Make sure one person is doing the numbers while another person is doing the talking. So there's some fairly standard negotiating tactics that you'll need to employ. And if there are questions you can't answer, don't want to answer, put them on the back burner, put a hold in so it's stop and say, oh, well, we'll come back to you. You don't have to make a decision. You can stop in the meeting. You don't have to go through with it. So I would say standard negotiation techniques and market research.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Lizzie. I'm sorry that we cannot ask all the other questions anymore. We have a very short amount of time, but I will try my best to bring back the panelists again, hopefully in the summer, again with the next step on the commercialization software. Can I just ask one quick question? Whoever wants to answer. Basically, it seems that software commercialization is quite different than classic tech transfer. Can be quite different and subjective. So would basically a kind of a let's say a not necessarily a course, but some kind of a place that you can go and ask about your case study, would that be of any interest to tech transfer professionals, you think, based on your experience? Mark, for example, if you.
I do, and I'm looking at the questions in the chat here, and it's like, but what if your university hasn't got any experience in it? Well, yeah, I mean, then you need to get training, right? I need to go on Elizabeth's negotiations course. So it sounds great. I always let my wife do the negotiation because the pausing and just walking away, it really does work, and I just can't do that.
Yeah,
yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think yeah, we absolutely do need, and there are software training courses out there.
Yeah, even more advanced maybe should. Well, thank you, Delphina, as well. Thank you so much, everyone. Sorry. We have to finish the webinar, well, wrap up the webinar. Let's say thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We will share a recording of the session as I said, hopefully ASAP. If you have any questions and would like to discuss your software commercialization challenge, please email myself, sahand@zbl.oxentia.com, and I will answer your questions, or we'll put you in touch with one of our panelists. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Have a lovely evening, even if it's raining. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.